Thank you for having me, and I'd have to say thank you to OCA and Art Space and the Australian Council for the Arts. It's a very exciting and energising experience to be here with everyone and listening to the work that you do here at the Dhaka Art Summit. I am a Wiradjuri woman from central New South Wales. I grew up in northern New South Wales in a place called Inverell, Gamilaroi country. My grandfather was born at Bellar Creek. My father grew up camping on the banks of the Lachlan River. And now I have made a place, very lucky to be a visitor living and working on Wiradjuri country. So I wanted to start with a story for something that gives me energy there and a lot of other people, the Merry Creek. And this is an example of some of the Indigenous Futures writing I do, one that you could, I guess, I'll talk about later, called the Dystopia Now. Tully is standing in line with the other girls. Since signing up, she'd been told she would be relocated at the next community meeting. A few days ago, she had travelled to the station with a group she didn't recognise, headphones in, eyes unfocused, hoods up. On the short bus ride, they passed new demolished suburbs, busy with hazard uniforms. Biodegradable plastic plant guards flapped around dying seedlings in the neatly fenced off lots. Hope Station was built on a narrow strip of land where the back opened to the Merry Merry. The front of the station welcomed visitors to a solid pine community hall and made Tully think of environmentally sustainable retreat advertisements in primary school camps. All the buildings tucked behind were flimsy, airless demountables. That morning, Tully walked out of her dorm to see government policy officers wandering around the station. She could tell someone had told them to dress casual. They were all wearing polo shirts with various department slogans like "Decolonise Now" and "Article 10." Finally, doors moved and a frowning customer service worker lets them into the hall. A registration desk with more polo shirts fills the front space. Tully waits until she gets waved over. She gives her customer registration number and watches while an assistant taps her details into the screen. I see you've signed up for the Work for Restoration program last week. Yeah, I suppose they told me I had to sign up to get my payments. Thank you for your commitment, you are our future, he says flatly. Here are your relocation papers. Handing over a stack of forms, he quickly turns over pages showing her all the different places she has to sign. Tully starts reading, and the officer becomes agitated. Cold air con shrinks the room. Tully tries to concentrate. Restless bodies keep inching closer. You can read the paper over there, he snaps, pointing to some cardboard booths lined up against the wall. The assistant avoids looking at her and nods to the next in line. I don't understand. It says I'm relocating to Wiradjuri country, but my mob is from New South Wales, and you have been relocated according to the Article 10 agreement. Tully reads the disclaimer at the bottom of the forms. It says, I understand that by agreeing to the terms and conditions of my relocation, I waive the right to any other forms of future compensation under Article 10 of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. A few rows up, Tully sees a girl crying and refusing to sign the forms. Two protection officers move in and everyone watches with heavy silence as the girl is pulled towards the emergency exit. It reminds Tully of the time the orange-haired curly-haired copper pulled out pepper spray and called her. She watched them bounce her friend's head off the ground. Useless legs couldn't move. She was stuck to the bitumen for ages, after the red and blue lights were gone. Tully hears a girl yelling now. She sinks into square patches of grey government carpet and signs. The assistant smiles strangely for the first time and stamps her papers. He tells Tully to line up again and wait for the welcome. She stands with the rest of the newly relocated women. A video link starts loading on a projected screen. So I'll just stop there. So Indigenous Futurisms are much more than a genre. Our futures are the dystopian now, descendants of the imaginary future, sovereign romanticisms, unreconciliatory apocalypses, second invasions, and feminine. And I'd like to say that it's Anishinaabe academic Ray Stillen who coined the term Indigenous Futurisms to describe a form of storytelling where Indigenous peoples use speculative fiction to challenge colonialism and envision our futures. And speculative fiction, I can try, I guess, and attempt to define or explain what that is for people that might not know. It is fictional work that describes future. It's different to science fiction in that it presents things that are more likely to happen and focus more on the sociological speculation rather than other things in science fiction where it might look at technological advancement. So I love futurisms and I work with Indigenous futurisms because I'm interested in how they become interventions into the way we are studied, written about and interviewed. I also think Indigenous futures are a strong way to contest other environmental and Anthropocene explorations through art. Tony Birch explained in a great piece the kind of enlightened white liberal that is concerned about the environment. And I guess the problem with the environmental enlightenment, or in some Anthropocene art, probably not all art, Anthropocene art, is that the settler or the colonizer becomes the individual subject of climate change. So they are the individual that climate change is happening to, rather than the story of the climate trauma and the country itself. So I want to talk about why Indigenous future practices are pretty different to other speculative practices, and look at a few devices I've come across, and definitely not all of them that Indigenous artists use, just a few, and also give an example of future tense interviews that I've used in the past with a few artists and curators. The dystopian now. So Indigenous artists have no problem speculating undesirable futures, particularly in a settler colonial body. We are not post-colonial in Australia. Ongoing settler occupation is unnatural and has harmed our life and land. So in some ways we are already in a post-apocalyptic environmental wasteland that has been transposed onto our territories, resources and waters. While attempts at decolonial thought by non-Indigenous scholars talk a lot about centering our knowledges, they still envision futures in which they have access to our thoughts, in which they have access to our imaginations and access to our ways of surviving the end of the world post-climate event. So just like the dystopian reality of now, the future can be mined for our Indigenous ecological knowledges. But the dystopian now isn't the end of the world. We have already experienced that in some way. So the real work begins when Indigenous people imagine our utopia, which is the end of the settler occupation. And in this sense, the end of their world is not the end of our world. We are the descendants of a future imaginary that has already passed. Lindsay Nixon talks about speculative visualities. used to project our life into the future imaginary, subverting the death imaginary ascribed to our bodies by the colonisers. And the death imaginary, I guess, is where we're represented as disappearing in order to legitimise their invasion or occupation of other people's lands. We contest colonial representations of the myth of a dying race or a disappearing race with our own imaginings and art practices into the future present, and we can imagine and create ourselves into being. I guess it started for me a while ago. I used to co-publish a zine with another collaborator. The zine was called Sovereign Apocalypse, and in 2013-14, in the first issue of the zine, it was the first time I attempted to conduct a future tense interview with a very well-known artist, Richard Bell. It's not a very great interview, and the writing isn't very good. But what stuck with me is that in the interview I kept speculating scenarios of our future sovereignty and control, and Richard Bell kept calling my ideas very romantic. And so in that way, Romanticism of our futures allowed my imagination to become a bit of an authority. So sovereign romanticism is something that presents us with play and possibilities of our collective sovereignties, maybe. The second invasion as an Indigenous allegory device that can tell the stories of now through imagining the future invasion of the colonizer. In speculative fiction scenarios, where the cruelties inflicted on our peoples are returned upon those people who benefit from stolen land. A classic example of this might be an alien invasion and colonisation of humanity on Earth. And there is, and this is a review of a text that an author, Claire Coleman, wrote in Australia, which is called Terra Nullius, which is an alien invasion. I guess there is a danger in the second invasion where different audiences would be reading different things, and it could serve colonial empathy for their actions for non-Indigenous peoples. But for Indigenous readers, it irreversibly cements the first invasion in our experiences. Oh no, what did I do? Sorry, I'm just finding where I'm up to on my notes. So we don't necessarily project futures in which time reconciles our conflicts with settlers or colonisers. In many Indigenous apocalypses I have read or viewed or have written or come across, settlers and colonisers are mostly projected as unresolved. So Indigenous futures are beyond the creative output, are also policy alternatives, and for me it is an alternative to reconciliation. I guess thinking about the time when I grew up, for my generation, a lot of my childhood was post the Mabo decision, overturning Terra Nullius, which means there was also, in the aftermath of that, large public symbolic gestures and rhetoric of reconciliation. The danger of that is the unspoken requirement of our forgiveness, I guess. And in some circumstances, depending on how that's interpreted, could seem like consent to continued occupation on lands. And I quote from Cree writer Erica Violetley, "But it seems that with any idea of reconciliation I've heard, there is an unspoken requirement of Indigenous forgiveness and Indigenous consent to continued occupation. Even within our own communities, the onus is on women, Two-Spirit people and children to forgive those who have harmed us. Healing, we are told, cannot begin to happen until we forgive colonial sins of the past. And that's just an image of some empty archives, an installation I had, and that's Paperbark and Lily Pilly archives that are empty with the stories of the colonisers. A lot of depictions, I guess, that I look to in the future and that I'm surrounded by have tended towards an ideology of feminine futures, and this future brings a central focus on Indigenous ways of being and knowing, like relationality and the role Indigenous women have in guiding us in future communities. So that's just a little section of a virtual reality interview I did with Paula Balla from the Sovereignty exhibition at the Australian Centre of Contemporary Art, just a review of the exhibition through imagining the curator conducting a virtual reality tour. So I use future tense to interview people about their work. It's about collective imagining of their practice and how decolonisation could be imagined in art practices. Many Indigenous artists, when talking about work, use collective pronouns. Indigenous pronouns like I or my work or those things don't always work for artists. And we definitely have the ability to view art as coming from both the artists and the community, not necessarily in obvious ways, but there is a specific timeline I use for future tense interviews. I have a set of questions where I ask the artist or the curator to imagine their work as a community, that their sculpture or their painting or their exhibition is living and breathing. In most scenarios, the interviewer is from the future and is returning to these communities to record their stories. So these are some examples of the questions I would ask in an interview, where the artist is imagining they're answering for their artwork, not necessarily for themselves. Sometimes this can translate into a traditional Q&A format, or sometimes, more often than not, a short creative response. In my experience, all Indigenous people have been able to answer these questions from the perspective of their art as collective or art as a community. I haven't had the same experience when using these questions with non-Indigenous artists. So I'll read a small section of an interview as an example. So this was an interview with an artist, Hannah Bronte, on her video work, Still I Rise. Still I Rise imagines a universe where the governing body is comprised of strong Indigenous women from all around the world. And this is just a little section of the interview. Still I Rise field research entry, personal note. I have returned to this past timeline to determine if the intended trajectory will lead to sovereign futures. I notice instead of weeping for the end, this community felt the blessing of beginning and held the force and time of nature inside, each body consecrated with a matriarchal line full of knowledge from mother up to mother and out beyond creation. Textures and form circles that pull each woman into her embrace through weaving natural fibres of deep work and energy. This community regenerate back to before the start, where the end was. Transcript of interview. What are you titters doing? We are changing the agricultural system, removing invasive introduced species detrimental to our lands and health. We are returning to native grains, plants and animals.
And one thing, first video I think you saw, there's some name or about something. In our tradition, now these days, because we are looks like modern or something, so they when they it's kind of not kind of the, when they fix the marriage things for girls or boys, so go to the forest, bring the marriage pillar to create in the courtyard, and it's called mandap, so that's first we call actually panda, who's a priest. That's the first axe used in the tree to cut use that pillar, and that bark goes through somewhere, and it's like the bark turn like with the top in the sky, and it put like that's bark on the ground. So they said, okay, after marriage children will be girl or boy, so some kind of situations happen, but today also they have problem in rural areas in India, because I face also, I grew up very narrow place and in the jungle area, so that's why I can understand this his problem also. And but now we are surviving, and we are trying to do something good and recovering. Thank you.
By the indigenous peoples, and so they got a conference together of all these old men and women sat around a table like this, except in a circle, and they wanted to solve one question: what is culture? They wanted to solve that problem, and each elder goes around, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, tells their story about their culture and so on. They go around. And but at the end, the people who gathered there said, but we want to know the definition of culture. We want to put in the books. We want to be respectful to you. What's culture? So they went away 2-3 hours later. They come back and they sit around in a circle. And one of the elders stands up. It's mostly Cree people, some Dakota and Nakota people. Dene, they come back, and a Cree elder stands up and he says, we've solved the problem. He says, what we do at our place, that's our culture. What he does over there, that's his culture, that's her culture, that's their culture. And so now I want to get into the theory part of it. There's very little that is indigenous knowledge. It almost doesn't exist. It exists in this room, and I'll explain in a minute. There's Sami knowledge. There's Cree knowledge, there's Métis knowledge, there's Tahltan knowledge. Those knowledges are part of a particular territory. And sometimes they translate to other places. There are things in common. You talk about sharing. We're talking about respect for relationships with things that are more than human. And there's a list of things that we generally would agree upon. And we could call that indigenous. But it only has real meaning in those specific territories. So a Tahltan person isn't going to tell a Sami person how to live their life, and then we would then be indigenous. However, on the plains when colonization came in, you had the Blood people and the Cree people, just for an example, and they recognized that they were each human. But this is a Cree person and that's a Blackfoot person. They had their territory separately. But when colonization came in, they said, holy shit, we're Indians now, right? Suddenly we have something that's more in common with each other than with the Europeans coming in. So in the Blackfoot territory, the Bloods, the Kainai, the Siksika, the Tsuut'ina, they all got together and became the Blackfoot Confederacy because they were stronger as a united nation. But they still were separate, still are separate to this day. So in the 20th century, as our respectful knowledge keeper and elder explained, everyone became Aboriginal, or where I'm from became Indians. And they wore that proudly, Brotherhood of Indians, and these autonomous organizations took place. But now in the last 20, 25 years, we have a new sense of being called Indigenous. So if I meet people from other nations like here in this table, and we have anything in common, that's Indigenous. The fact that we meet is the performance of indigeneity. This is Indigenous, okay? But that's not the same thing as our home communities. And if we think we've understood something and we feel very strong and we all have agreement here, and you go home and you can't explain it to them and they agree, there's Indigenous and there's Sami or Tahltan or whatever. This is very important because if we perform in these academic spaces, in these no places, right, from one place after another, and we don't test our theories and our ideas at home, that's Indigenous in a negative sense. If we are, it's a class system as you were describing. I think that's an important thing. So Indigenous is a performance that happens in these spaces, but is not to be taken seriously. Words, as you were saying, you know, they're only a problem if you take them seriously. Indigenous is not a word to be taken seriously. Sami, Métis, Cree, those are to be taken seriously. That's all I'm saying.
How do our utopias look like? How do our dystopias look like? And it is very important. I have actually personally been in a moment where we won a battle that we hadn't not imagined that we would win that. So it's a very tense situation outside the Norwegian Parliament, and we are. It is 10th of October 1979, and then all of a sudden we hear in the radio that the Prime Minister is giving in, and we of course are very, very happy that we are not used to win. Then the afterwaves of that victory are very challenging for the whole Sami society as a society, because on the society level you have always somebody who is allied with the government, and you have people who are resisting the government. So if you win against the government, how shall you then do with those who have been allied with the government? So that's one complication, and there are other complications that what shall the next steps be? Shall we go to this mountain or shall we go to this mountain? And then we can be so full of energy, so full of war energy, because we were right in a war. So then we have the risk of starting small and big wars between ourselves, because we are so in the fight still. So these questions are very important to raise and to approach artistically, so that they can be sort of tasted by ourselves and our communities, so that we can be prepared. So you are sort of whiny, what we call a seer. Thank you so much for being that.
Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned this process is slow, allowing time for her ecosystem to readjust. We are repurposing much of the past system's infrastructure for housing and creating green spaces within old CBDs. And I use a little bit of this example because the artist had said that never before she visualized what the actual land or the country in her universe that she was creating looked like. until after that interview, and then she had much more of a clear image. So yeah, those are the parts of Indigenous Futures that I've been interested in exploring so far. The Dystopia now, Descendants of the Imaginary Future, Sovereign Romanticisms, Unreconciliatory Apocalypses, Second Invasions, and the Feminine.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for that evocative presentation. Any questions and comments?
Hi. Thanks so much. Have you interviewed any performance artists or artists that are working in sort of ongoing tangible art? Really interesting.
I did have a conversation with Nicole Monks, who has a lot of performance and bodywork as part of her practice. That still established a place of like imagining land and country for her body and the work that her body would be doing in that place for her. Yeah.
Can I ask you, what's your primary space or even secondary and tertiary space of presentation of your work? And because you spoke about the scenes, you work with sound.
Yes. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say what I do. Mostly, I guess I would say writing, but I do work with installation and sound in some of the writing that I do. But I wouldn't necessarily say visual artist, but I guess people say multidisciplinary or anti-disciplinary, but mostly writing and stories.
How do you distribute them? How do they work? I mean, I'm very curious to understand how they travel across spaces and times, because you speak about time. I think it's nice to hear.
Yeah. A lot of it has been recorded, not a lot of it actually, some of the work has been sound work. I think one of the pictures I showed was a still from an audio-visual installation called Long Water that was part of Yirramboi First Nations Arts Festival in Melbourne, which was a sound piece where the story was recorded with, I guess, ecological acoustics of the place that the story was actually about, presented in an installation. And a lot of it on the internet as well, I guess. That's the beauty of having the internet to put things up there and publish things.
I think Richard Bell, I'm glad that you kind of got to involve him in this kind of imagination, this project of yours. He actually said something really, really interesting a couple of years ago when I interviewed him about his work, and it was a film work, and the title was Imagining Victory. And I'd never thought in those terms before. I never thought about, well, we're brought up to be activists, we're brought up to be politically active and to be politically conscious, and to have some kind of liberation struggle, but we're not taught to imagine what happens if we win that liberation struggle. So yeah, it's a sovereign future is one way to imagine victory. So I applaud you. It's really interesting work.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really great talk. Richard Bell kind of being the first place that I was developing the idea of using the future tense in that way. Yeah.
Can I ask an additional question? I'm very curious if you usually present your methodology, or how do you usually present your work? Why did you feel that in this space? It's very interesting that you are presenting your methodology in this space, and if you can say something more about why That's
Yeah, this is the first time I'd actually thought about writing about the methodology of Indigenous Futurisms and what I had used in my work. I've never done it before in this way, and I thought also there are a lot of Indigenous speculative fiction writers in Australia that are doing this work as well, and globally. So I had been having really good experiences with conducting the future tense interview as ways of responding to people's work differently, and I thought it was a really good opportunity to use this time at the Dhaka Art Summit and with the Sovereign Words program to actually think critically about what I was doing and where the methodology was at, and perhaps what might be wrong with it, or what needs, or where it could potentially go in the future as well.
Thank you, Hannah. That was really great. I wanted to ask about the voice or the being or persona that asks the questions, and if how you conceptualize that.
Yeah.
What that is.
Yeah, there are like a few different scenarios that I had written as a good point that for different people that I have worked on the interview with, I might come up with a particular scenario, a particular point of view, for them to get into the point of imagining where this person was coming from. And so it's also an area of play where in imagining this sovereign future, perhaps this is an ideal or kind of total control of our territories, lands and resources of this sovereign explorer that has perhaps returned to country in a sense, or is coming from the ideal point that you could imagine for an Indigenous sovereign explorer to come back and record these stories and then present them to the future, and see whether they fit against the criteria that this imagined future might have for their sovereignty at that time.
That scene. So somebody saw what was going to happen, and you had to have some special gifts in order to be that seer. And your practice addresses these very important questions. Where are we going? How do our utopias look like? How do our dystopias look like? And it is very important. I have actually personally been in a moment where we won a battle that we had not imagined that we would win that. So it's a very tense situation outside the Norwegian Parliament, and we are, it is 10th of October 1979. And then all of a sudden we hear in the radio that the Prime Minister is giving in. And we, of course, are very, very happy. But we are not used to win. Then the afterwaves of that victory are very challenging for the whole Sami society as a society, because on the society level you have always somebody who is allied with the government, and you have people who are resisting the government. So if you win against the government, how shall you then
do with those who have been allied with the government. So that's one complication. And there are other complications that what shall the next steps be? Shall we go to this mountain or shall we go to this mountain? And then we can be so full of energy, so full of war energy, because we were right in a war. So then we have the risk of starting small and big wars between ourselves, because we are so in the fight still. So these questions are very important to raise and to approach artistically, so that they can be sort of tasted by ourselves and our communities, so that we can be prepared. So you are sort of whiny, what we call a seer. Thank you so much for being that.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad you mentioned the word preparedness, because I think that is definitely part. Preparedness is part of the practice of Indigenous FutureISMs, preparedness for our communities and how we explore those stories and how that can actually make those conversations happen so we can be prepared.
Thank you for that, and I thought it was really interesting how you started with a story which was on the now, and that sort of drew me very differently into your presentation, which was also talking about the future, and that you brought in the idea of forgiveness. It's a very, very large subject. I think it just leaves so much to think about when we talk about forgiveness. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Hannah, I actually wanted to ask you about that. You mentioned, did I understand rightly, you mentioned reconciliation was something you rejected because it assumed that the community would be asked to forgive and at the same time accept a continuation of the status quo.
Yes, yeah, I do, yeah, I think that sums it up. And I think maybe that's particularly in the context of reconciliation in Australia, maybe not everywhere else, but that's kind of where, for us, which was like the Howard era conversation of reconciliation, meant, I think, meant those things, that we were kind of being forced to forgive without any reparation, and that it would lead to the usual that it would just mean that their continued occupation or invasion of the country would be even more legitimised in the eyes of the colonisers.
So, following that train of thought one step further, in your interviews, in your writing, have you asked that question? Have you interviewed somebody about that question? What would be a speculative future with regards to this issue?
On reconciliation? I haven't quite done that yet. Something that's a little bit, very different, but maybe similar is I have had a project which was called Refuge, which was preparedness for environmental disasters, and a simulation of a refuge, 24-hour scenario. And I copied what would be like the Red Cross form for people that would be seeking refuge in an environmental disaster, except I changed the format of the form to be about acknowledging countries and also asking at what point did your ancestors come, if it was relevant to them, at what point did your ancestors come and live on somebody else's unceded land and why. And out of, I think I had 25 participants who were doing that simulation, and only one non-Indigenous person could answer the date of their ancestors coming over, and why they had. So I think that was a different way of looking at those conversations. Turning the narrative, making the colonizers look at their own personal narrative of migration and why they're there.
I wanted to thank you very warmly for that. Just another question?
Actually, not a question. I was thinking about the ongoing recent debate in Australia about the National Day observation, you know. So in that case, do you have any personal opinion about this?
I'm sorry, what?
The celebration of Australian National Day issues, yeah.
Well, that's a very big question. I definitely have personal opinion about having any national day of celebration, but there are varied perspectives within and politics within the Aboriginal community. It's not a day that I personally celebrate. And I hadn't really thought about a national celebration in terms of Indigenous futures and where that would fit, so maybe I will.
So I would like to ask everybody to give a very warm hand of applause for